pull up the graph and display it on the screen or just show it to Dr. Price, ask him what he thinks about it. Credit goes to Paul Foster for collecting the data from 109 participants in a survey on Pauline authorship at 2011 British New Testament Conference, which was about 70% of attendees. A few declined to vote on the pastoral epistles, and a couple of them only voted on 2 Thessalonians. This graph makes it obvious that the so-called 7 authentic epistles garner a lot of support for Pauline authorship, with the exception of a vote against Philippians and Philemon, presumably by the same skeptic. If Dr. Price could play devil's advocate regarding the lucky 7, how would he explain the unanimity among scholars on the genuine Pauline authorship? And if we grant that these 7 letters are synonymous, does he think that they were all composed by the same forger, hence why they display the same thematic elements and style? Dr. Bob?
Well, I'm very interested in this topic, and what this more or less consensus does is to accept Bultmann's, I'm sure they know it's what he thought, but I'm sure it's not because he said it that they're convinced. But Bultmann said that the 4 Hauptbriefe, or principal epistles, as Bauer called them, the 2 Corinthians, the Galatians and Romans, 1 Thessalonians, Philippians, and Philemon, Bultmann accepted that, whereas Bauer had said it's just the Hauptbriefe, Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, and had various arguments why the others were not. And I find those arguments pretty persuasive. As to the pastoral epistles, it seems to me it's really a stretch to say that they're Pauline, partly because it's difficult to picture the Sitz and Leben, the context in which they originated. Why does Paul set out a whole church order, which he does in one of the Timothys and in Titus, if he's just about to visit the recipient? Why doesn't he? Well, this of course means that he isn't, that this is being sent to whoever reads it, various bishops and so on, as if Paul were visiting them. Here is what he would say. The vocabulary has much more in common with the apostolic fathers, so-called 1st and 2nd Clement, Ignatius's epistles, Polycarp's epistle, and so forth, than with Luke Acts, than with any of the others with Paul's name on them. There are, and in fact, this also suggests a link. I think Stephen G. Wilson discussed in his book Luke and the Pastoral Epistles that there's a real good case to be made that the author of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts also wrote the pastoral epistles. They have the same. I mean, I'm convinced of that. I have a chapter, I guess, a section in my book, The Widow Traditions in Luke Acts, where I say, yeah, I think this is the case. And I regard Philippians virtually as a 4th pastoral epistle. It has the same sort of fictive scene of writing that Paul is at the end of his life. He's about to be executed, and that will bring him to the perfection he does not claim to have attained yet. And he knows he may die, but that's fine with him because he'll go to be with Christ. Nonetheless, he's pretty sure he won't be executed because it's good for them if God lets him continue to minister to them. I think that's a wink to the reader saying, well, of course, as you know, Paul did get executed, but he is continuing his ministry through these pseudonymous letters. Pseudonymous letter writing was not unusual back then. There are various letters signed Plato and from various Stoics, cynics, and so on, that where probably nobody was being fooled. It's like, here's what he would say if he were still around. And so the Schleiermacher started the ball rolling on the pastorals. He thought of them only the so-called First Timothy was pseudepigraph, and he compares it with Second Timothy and Titus, and so he still thought they were by Paul, but they widened the scope of the scrutiny. Subsequent scholars did, and began to notice similar things that Schleiermacher had noticed about First Timothy in connection with Second, the vocabulary problems, the ecclesiastical setting, that there are groups of bishops, deacons, consecrated widows. Was this going on in Paul's day, in the early years of Christianity? It seems anachronistic. The idea of faith no longer is the sort of the ultimate concern, existential stance you find in the earlier Pauline epistles. Now it means the faith, the creed, the Christian belief, and in Philippians these trends have already begun. There also, we hear of groups, of boards of bishops and deacons, and that just seems anachronistic. As Bauer pointed out, Philippians also uses what appears to be Gnostic terminology. For instance, when it says that Christ emptied himself, it's the same word, kenosis, the self-emptying, that it's cognate with the kenoma, which was the realm outside the divine pleroma in Gnosticism. It was empty of the divine light. So you had the fullness, the pleroma in the Godhead, and then the kenoma outside. And Jesus went, or whoever you want to call him before that, he went from one to the other to do his saving work. And so it's, and the whole, I mean, Philippians just drips with hints that, yeah, we know Paul is really dead by now. I haven't attained perfection yet, by golly, but I will, because I pray I will share the resurrection of Christ and all this. So I think that that one is probably not authentic. Not that it serves any purpose, any hobby horse theory of mine. I just found what Bauer had to say convincing. Obviously, Bultmann didn't, because he said, it's good enough, it's by Paul. First and Second Thessalonians, I tend to think, are spurious, and again, I'm just parroting what F.C. Bauer said, that in both you have the request or the order that this letter should be read to the whole congregation. Why would he say that if this were really a letter from Paul to the church at Thessalonica? I mean, if he's writing it to the church and not, say, Bishop Serapion or something, of course it's going to be read to the congregation. What this implies is that somebody has forged a letter as if by Paul, whose letters are all read to the congregation like scripture. And this writer is saying, I want you to include these in the readings. And so he's like, he's sort of tipping his hand there. First Thessalonians seems clearly to refer to the fall of Jerusalem, and that God's wrath has come upon them at last. That what else could that refer to? And of course, conservative scholars say, well, either it means something else, or mainstream critical scholars will say, okay, that's an interpolation. But that's not an absurd view. I think Margaret Barker says that too. It's because there are a number of interpolations in the Pauline letters. But it's you got to wonder when Second Thessalonians says, now don't get upset by some prophecy or letters supposedly from us saying that the day of the Lord has already come or is at hand or whatever it is. Because, oh, no, don't you remember when I was with you, I told you that this whole checklist of things had to happen first, and they haven't. Well, what letter with Paul's name on it said that the Thessalonians would have read? First Thessalonians. So it kind of sounds like you have two dueling pseudepigraphs there. And in Galatians, there are reasons to think it's not by Paul. For one thing, the similarity of the stories of Paul and his visit to the Jerusalem authorities so parallels that of Marcion to the Roman bishops. Both of them try to seal the deal with the promise of a monetary tribute and so forth, that I tend to think that it's not only not by Paul, but it's by Marcion, the great Paulinist. And especially since Tertullian said Marcion discovered the letter to the Galatians, which I take to mean like Joseph Smith discovering the Book of Mormon. I think the first couple of chapters, which so obviously clash with the Book of Acts, are a response to the Book of Acts and have been added to the original letter by Marcion. Let's see. Bauer said that it appears that in Romans that about half of chapter 4 and the 14, and the rest of the epistle is an addition or series of additions that serve the agenda of the Catholicizing project of the second century church. Oh, well, everybody got along well in the early church, because it makes Paul say that, we owe a debt to the Jerusalem community. We owe everything to them. It's a little hard to imagine, given the rest of the context, that's the case. Plus, Romans ends 3 times. There are 3 closings. And some people say, well, we don't really have any actual manuscripts where they end early. These changes would have been made before any manuscripts we have access to, so that really is no argument. Form critically, you pretty much have to say this much was an addition. Marcion's, though we don't have copies, there was a lot of interaction in the early church where the authors are saying, Marcion's version doesn't have this. He must have cut it out. Well, it's more likely, I think, that it was added in. Well, chapters 9 through 11 of Romans don't appear in the Marcionite version. And no coincidence, in those chapters, the author refers to Jews as Israel, whereas in the rest of the epistle, it's the Jews. Now, why would he suddenly flip? There's 1 or 2 exceptions, but on the whole, you can easily see this is different, and that would be a kind of a big clue that you got somebody else writing. There are good reasons to believe that most of chapter 1 of Romans was a Hellenistic synagogue sermon, trying to show the error of the pagans and how it all boils down to them rejecting the true God to serve idols, and look at the moral repercussions of it and so on. We have sources for what Jews in the diaspora said to pagans. This is the same sort of thing. And interestingly, it does not talk about how everybody is a sinner and we have to be saved by the grace of God through Christ. It just says you'll find hypocritical Jews, you'll find noble pagans who don't happen to have the Torah, but they have the commandments of God written on their heart. That's not Pauline Christianity. And that brings up another question. Though there is stylistic similarity between the various epistles, that doesn't really settle the question of one or many authors, because there are also statistical oddities where you have certain vocabulary used in Philippians that doesn't really appear anywhere else, and so forth. And with the similarity in style need mean no more than that you have a Pauline school, which scholars speak of, the people who were writing these letters. If Paul were around, what would he say to this? And just like people point out the similarity between the three Johannine epistles and the Gospel of John. I mean, it's so similar, and yet there are stark differences that lead scholars to say it looks like you have a schism within a group that had intergroup lingo, which we can see today from one denomination to another. And in the same way, there are gross contradictions in a single Pauline letter, like I think even Romans 9 through 11 is three different fragments. People have a terrible time trying to figure out what's he saying here. It seems like he shifts gears twice. He's talking about individual predestination. He's talking about why have the Jews rejected Christ? Is that going to last forever? And then yet another one. In 1 Corinthians 15 about the resurrection, part of it seems to be arguing against those who believe there was no afterlife at all. But part of it seems to be trying to combat a Gnostic view that there is a kind of a resurrection, but it was in baptism and it's purely spiritual. Like, what's going on? Was this guy a multiple personality? There are also, especially in 1 Corinthians, such contradictions as on the same issue that you have to start wondering if we had various people sewing new patches into the quilt, like on the question of can women pray and prophesy in public? Well, there's a pretty good long discussion of that. The consecrated virgins can do that, but nobody else. They ought to wear a symbol of authority on their head. And then in chapter 14, no, women can't speak in church. Let them ask their husbands when they get home if they wonder about something. Did the same guy write that? The discussion of spiritual gifts. If you compare chapters 12 and 14, it appears that there's a subtle shift, that 14 is sort of, whoever wrote that is impatient with the whole Pentecostal mess, and they say, okay, that's it. Whereas it's more friendly to it in 12, and in 13, which Vreda already thought was an insertion, but he thought that Paul had this, he had already written this poem basically and decided to stick it in here. That seems less likely to me, since the point of it seems to be almost like Dallas Seminary. We don't need prophecy in tongues anymore. And so if you look closely at it, it seems like there are different opinions about this, like you're reading Nave's Topical Bible. Let's take it topic by topic and put all different materials in there. Or the thing with should Christians eat meat previously offered in idol sacrifices? Well, there's this long thing arguing, what the heck, it's just meat. We know better than to take these false gods seriously. Though you might be careful if you have a Christian pal that wants to go with you and he doesn't understand that and thinks you're actually worshiping Christ and Apollo. But then we go into this thing, no, Christians can't do this. It'll be like the Israelites at Baal Peor, where thousands of them were slapped down by God. Don't let this happen to you. Or can we take money from congregations to whom we minister? He makes this long argument. Well, yes, of course. Deuteronomy says this. Is it really about animals letting the ox tread the ground, and so forth? But then he says, but of course, I don't ever do this.
All within the same area.
Yeah, it looks to me like nobody makes such a strong case for the view that they reject. And it seems to me you just have various tracts included side by side, so that it's like one of these InterVarsity Press books that are really neat. 4 views of this, like Eschatology or the Atonement, or the one I was in, the Historical Jesus. Those are great books, and that's what I think you have here. Somebody collected Paulinist materials, and as Van Manen said, it's not simply that these letters are pseudepigraphs written under a pseudonym, but each one of them appears to be a patchwork quilt, as I just tried to show with a couple of these. And there are other scholars like Bornkamm and Schmidtals who have analyzed the Corinthian letters and Philippians, and independently these two scholars came up with exactly the same analysis of Philippians as a composite of 3 fragments, same ones. So it's sort of repeatable results. And now they think that both scholars thought Paul wrote all of them, but that they've just been crammed together. And Schmidtals thought you could divide 1st and 2nd Corinthians into at least a dozen different snippets that they put together to preserve them. And so authorship and integrity are 2 different issues. One last thing about Ephesians. People say that, a lot of people say, like my Professor Gordon Fee said, he just can't imagine this is not Pauline. It sounds so Pauline, and it does. But as Edgar Goodspeed pointed out decades ago, this is because virtually everything in Ephesians is closely paralleled by this or that sentence in various Pauline epistles. And the few that are not seem to be taken from the Septuagint. And what are the chances of this? And he says that it looks like this was supposed to be an introduction to a collection of Pauline epistles. Well, no wonder it sounds like him. It's like one of these things where somebody sends a ransom note, and it's made of letters cut out of different magazine fonts and all that. That's basically what you got. And so, of course, it sounds Pauline, but just too Pauline, you might say. That argument is made about the secret gospel of Mark and the letter that quotes it from Clement of Alexandria. People say, well, this sure sounds like Clement of Alexandria. We have a lot of his writings. And somebody pointed out, yeah, but it sounds too much like him, because this is a short excerpt and it's crawling with the favorite vocabulary of Clement. Looks like Morton Smith made it up. And it's the same sort of thing here. And so you can go on and on and on, but I tend to favor what W.C. Van Manen said about certain broad issues here. Like, why does Paul give a retrospective look? He says, don't exalt Apollos or Cephas or Paul or whatever. Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in Paul's name? I don't think so. And he says, really, Christ is the thing that matters.
Sounds like developed schools right there. Like,
yeah.
These are already people who are being put on pedestals. So how did that
And he
happen?
says, he gives this backward glance. He said, I planted the seed, founding your church. Apollos watered. It was God who gave the growth. That's all that matters. What, is the whole thing over? I mean, it wouldn't have to mean it, but it sort of sounds like somebody is looking at Paul and Apollos as figures of the past. Whenever Paul's quote says, remember the traditions that I delivered to you. Wait a minute, this is like the first couple of weeks of Christianity, and they're talking about traditions that Paul once gave? Or the idea that there are Christological hymns. So when Colossians various bits and pieces. They had Christian hymns that early. They could have, it's possible, or bits of creeds and formulae like 1 Corinthians 15, the list of appearances, or the thing in the beginning of Romans. He was son of David according to the flesh, but declared son of God by an act of power in the resurrection. What is he quoting? Did they have Christian creeds yet? It just seems like it's the same thing with the pastoral epistles. It sounds too much like the church of the 2nd century. Romans, it's got another thing like 1 Thessalonians. It talks about how it quotes the Bible, that their table has become a snare to them. Sort of sounds like they're talking about the altar in Jerusalem being destroyed. And so I think that von Manen and F.C. Bauer and others sank that boat a long time ago. It's not ridiculous. I mean, I think it's almost ridiculous to say that the pastorals are genuinely Pauline. You really have to stretch it. It's worse than that with Hebrews, which doesn't even have Paul's name on it. Though I see why people... I mean, it's kind of like Paul, but there you go. That shows here's a similarity where Paul is not even supposed to be the writer. And so it's a question of whether you're going to look at external or internal evidence. And often apologists just look at broad a priori issues before looking at the actual text, and they try to explain away the anomalies. Well, to show how I try to be fair with this, in my books, The Pre-Nicene New Testament and The Amazing Colossal Apostle, in both I have introductory remarks to every epistle. And I take the Dutch radical view of von Manen and others that Paul wrote none of the epistles. And I try to show in my comments on the specific text that, you see, this really fits a post-Pauline scenario. But in the third Holy Fable volume, the Epistles and the Apocalypse Undistorted by Faith, there I say, now, you've heard what I had to say from that standpoint, but I don't dismiss the conventional Bart Ehrman type approach to the epistles. That makes sense too. Let's put those glasses on and see what sense we can make of this, and often quite good sense. But even there, I can't resist in footnotes saying, you notice this little problem? This is one reason why I don't happen to think this, but for the moment, let's see what... I mean, that's a viable paradigm, too. I don't deny that.
You and that tinfoil. I guess one more comment to just like a brief comment on this.
By the way, I like to think of it as my Stupanatron helmet.
Hey,
I don't know if anybody remembers Ren and Stimpy.
So Stephen Nelson asked this question, which was a great question, but looking at the British New Testament Conference on Pauline authorship on this map, they like all hook, line, and sinker out of the 109 that really vote here. Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, they all agree it's his, yes. Interesting thing is only one out of 109, so 108 said yes, and one said no to Philippians. Really strange in the British thing here. 1 Thessalonians, everyone says yes. 2 Thessalonians, different story.
Yeah.
You know, which is interesting. But they're far more conservative on their stance in terms of this than you are. And of course, none of them say yes, Hebrews. 9 say they're not sure, and then 100 say no. But I guess my thing is what do you think when you see charts like that? Do you think it's just the fact that these scholars are all taught within particular schools, and the particular schools of thought train them how to think about these texts, and it is not like the Pauline authentic writings, if you will, are never challenged. It's just kind of accepted. Maybe there's interpolations, but they don't really challenge this type of material that you're bringing to the table. Like when I saw you debate Bart Ehrman and you brought this up, he laughed it off. He's like, I am not even going to... we have nothing to talk. You're on Mars and I'm on Earth, and like we can't even go there. And you're like, well, you want to laugh it off? Fine. I can't even begin a conversation here because you're actually challenging the very texts that he says are authentic. What do you think of that?
Well, it's just a failure to be able to think outside the box, I think. Now there are, whoops, there we go. I'm trying to be a.
What do you think of that?
Well, I do think that they're embodied. It's like in the paper chase. Professor Kingsfield has written that he is a living link in the tradition of the law and how it's grown and how it's administered. That's kind of what's happened there. Your teachers have a kind of a tradition, and they influence you, and you become proud of having been taught by so and so. And I feel that way too, to a degree. I was taught, if you want to put it that way, by Darrell Dowdy at Drew University, and he was pretty critical. I thought too much so when I started, because I had the pretty much 7 lucky epistles and all that stuff in mind. And in fact, I began, as I happened to look into the Dutch radical theories and such, I would talk to him about it, and I found myself pushing him to the left on this stuff. It's just because stuff I had never noticed before, these arguments I never thought about, and I passed them on to him, and he began to go in the Dutch radical direction. But he was taught by Hans Conzelmann, who was one of the great German New Testament scholars and a disciple of Bultmann. I also had, one lousy class with Helmut Kester, another direct disciple of Bultmann. So I'm very proud of that kind of pedigree, but I cannot say that I was raised in it. I gravitated to it from having this conservative view. And the greatest example of that would be Donald Guthrie, who wrote this huge introduction to the New Testament. He was very conservative, but he had read everything. And my teacher at Gordon Conwell, David Scholler, he pointed out even, he knew everything too, but he was still pretty conservative. But he said that in a review of Guthrie's introduction, somebody said, yeah, boy, this is very scholarly and erudite, but what are the chances that he would accept the traditional authorship of 27 out of 27 books? You have to suspect that issue was settled already, and that it's really kind of not exactly apologetics, but you just, certain things will look plausible to you if you're in what Peter Berger calls a plausibility structure, where, you think Paul wrote Philippians, right? Oh, yes, he did. Okay, you find it's going to sound ridiculous, like to Bart. I don't know that he'd ever heard of any of the Dutch radicals or was even familiar with Bauer. He really laughed off the idea that Paul didn't write Galatians. Well, Karl Barth's teacher, Rudolf Steck, Barth was very conservative as a scholar and a theologian, but Rudolf Steck said Paul didn't write this. And Barth must have been educated in that, but he didn't buy it. But the thing is, it can't be that wacky if this guy that taught Karl Barth, not Bart Ehrman, if he thought that, and I just don't think that, I don't mean to insult him, and I don't know this, but the way he writes and talks, it seems to me he is so ensconced in a particular scholarly tradition. His Doktorvater, as they call him, his doctoral advisor was Bruce Metzger, a great scholar. I had the privilege of taking a class with him on the Sermon on the Mount. He's terrific, but he's real conservative, pretty much a fundamentalist in theology. And it does control his views of everything, really. But he's like Guthrie. If you want to get, well, it's only true up to a point because decades have passed, but he is amazingly comprehensive in his book about not only the reasons he thinks so-and-so wrote this and when and why, but he will deal with everybody's theory. And then he'll say, well, I think this is wrong for this and that reason. But you get the impression that there's something by another British scholar, I. Howard Marshall. I'm sorry to say all these people are dead now. I've read loads of their books and learned a lot from them. I. Howard Marshall wrote a little booklet on the parables, and one of the issues was, did Jesus really give these, or was it somebody else? And he says, well, I'm going to assume he did, because it's innocent until proven guilty. And that's kind of the paradigm they all work from. Unless you can prove to me that the traditional view is wrong, I'm still entitled to assume it's true. You can't do that. That is the opposite of real historical method, but seems to me that's what they all do. And they think it's great to just uphold that tradition. F.F. Bruce once said, another very conservative, extremely learned man, who's a Plymouth Brethren and brother, I guess, even. He said he gave a talk where he said he accepted that Isaiah was not written by one single author, that there was at least a second Isaiah. And he said that and nobody could question this guy's conservative credentials, but he said somebody in the audience of conservative seminarians or grad students said that made him feel uneasy because it was not the accepted view on our side, sort of. Well, that is exactly the point. And the guy seemed to understand the position he was in, that it sounded unacceptable because it's the other guys, it's the other team. And I think that kind of defines where these people are at. They're not necessarily con artists like creationist speakers are, where they've been refuted 1,000 times, never been able to respond to it, they just keep repeating the same nonsense. And it's not like that. It's like a certain school of thought that they were educated in, are loyal to, and it works well enough for them. But this is why I, however, always want to hear the eccentric views, because I found more than once that they caught something I didn't, because I had a particular set of lenses on. They didn't, and they saw something. Son of a gun, he's right. So I want to constantly be challenged, and that's the only way you're going to learn anything.